Okay, so today we're really diving deep into a fascinating, though admittedly complex topic, Antifa in the United States. You've sent us a really interesting mix of stuff, excerpts from Wikipedia, some pretty heated forum discussions online, and even a photo of a protest. Seems like you're really trying to wrap your head around this movement, the history, what they do, what they actually stand for. So, ready to unpack all of this.
Absolutely. This is what we do right. Unpacking complicated stuff, finding those really insightful nuggets. That's what makes these deep dives so rewarding.
Couldn't agree more. Now, the Wikipedia article, it jumps right in, defines Antifa as a decentralized, leaderless movement of left-wing anti-fascist groups. Seems straightforward at first glance, but something tells me there's more to it.
You're definitely right. And those online discussions you send over, man, they really show how difficult it is to really define Antifa.
Yeah, totally. You get some folks in the forums who think it's this broad, almost like instinctual anti-fascist ideology,
Right.
while others are convinced it's a structured organization like, do they have membership cards?
That's the thing, isn't it?
Yeah.
The paradox. If it's as decentralized as everyone says, no central leadership, can we even talk about Antifa as one entity?
Yeah.
Or is it more like a bunch of different groups all acting under that same label?
Yeah, and if so, what does that mean for their impact? It's like, how do you wrangle that?
Exactly.
It's fascinating and kind of mind-boggling, especially when you consider how far back they go.
You're thinking about the historical aspect from the Wikipedia article.
Exactly. I had no idea Antifa's origins go all the way back to anti-Nazi groups in 1930s Germany. We're talking almost a century of push and pull, action and reaction.
Yeah, it really shows how persistent the fight against fascism has been and how Antifa has had to adapt across different countries, different times. This isn't some static movement, right? It's a group or a bunch of groups that have been forced to evolve alongside their enemies.
And speaking of evolution, the article mentions Antifa coming back in a big way in the 70s and 80s to go up against those neo-Nazi skimheads in Europe. Talk about a different beast.
Totally.
It makes you think about how that historical context might be influencing how Antifa operates today, especially here in the U.S.
Absolutely. And that leads us to probably one of the most debated aspects of Antifa, their tactics. The Wikipedia article uses the term direct action, which can be a lot of things, protesting, publicly identifying people they claim are fascists, and this is where it gets really interesting, sometimes using violence.
Yeah, no, that's definitely the elephant in the room. And you can tell just from those forum discussions that it's a seriously divisive issue. You've got people who are very much defending the use of force as like a necessary evil, claiming it's the only language fascists understand.
And then, of course, you have those who say that violence just makes things worse, that it's like pouring gasoline on a fire, that it reinforces the very ideologies that Antifa wants to stop. And, both sides bring up some good points.
Yeah, it's a tough one. Where's the line between passionate activism and, crossing the line into violence? And can it ever really be justified, even when you're dealing with these ideologies centered on hate and oppression?
Those are questions, those are questions that philosophers, activists have been wrestling with for centuries. And the truth is, there's no simple answer. It seems like you're really struggling with that based on the sources you picked for this deep dive.
Yeah, it's a real ethical and moral tightrope walk, especially like when you think about the history of fascism and how real of a threat it is. Makes you wonder where that line is and who gets to decide where to draw it.
Right, yeah, no easy answers with that one. One thing that's been on my mind as we've been going through all of this is how often, like, Antifa gets painted in these really broad strokes. They're either righteous crusaders or masked villains.
Right.
Rarely do we ever get into the nuances, those gray areas.
It's true. And it's not like the media is helping. Like even the Wikipedia article mentions how right-leaning sources tend to frame Antifa as this inherently violent, organized force, just, hell-bent on chaos.
And then left-leaning sources are more likely to defend them, this necessary response to all this far-right extremism that's going around. It's like this weird hall of mirrors,
Yeah.
Almost impossible to tell what's real and what's not, let alone actually try to understand why they do what they do.
It's like everyone's talking about a totally different group. How are we supposed to make sense of that, especially if we're trying to get beyond those surface level takes and actually get to the heart of what Antifa is?
Well, that's where, our critical thinking comes in. It's really tempting, especially now with how much information's out there, to just stick with the stuff that already lines up with what we think.
Yeah.
But that's not going to give us the full picture.
Definitely not. We got to ask the hard questions. Who's saying this? What are their biases? And like, most importantly, does what they're saying actually hold up?
Exactly. And with Antifa, That means actually looking at what they've done, like specific actions, and judging those in context. Like that thing in the Wikipedia article about the Battle of Berkeley protests back in 2017. That became a huge deal in the whole debate about how Antifa
Oh,
operates.
yeah, I remember that. It was hard to miss. Antifa and those alt-right groups clashing violently, property damage. It seemed like everyone had a strong opinion on it, and it really just solidified those divisions we were talking about.
And it's a really good example of how important framing is.
Yeah.
Supporters of Antifa saw it as like self-defense, right? They were going up against white supremacists who were there to start fights. But those who criticized them, they condemned it as, this dangerous escalation that just made a bad situation worse.
It's wild. It's like two completely opposite sides of the same coin, and they both kind of reflect something real. It makes you realize just how tricky it can be to figure these things out.
Totally. And it shows just how important it is to find different points of view, especially when they challenge what we already think.
You're preaching to the choir here. Okay, so we've got this super complex, very decentralized movement. They have a long history of direct action, and they're working in this media landscape that is so incredibly divided. So if I'm following, to really get it, we need to go beyond those simple labels and actually look at what happened, like on a case-by-case basis.
Yeah, that's it. And there's this other event, it's in the Wikipedia article too, that I think is worth a closer look. The Unite the Right rally in Charlottesville back in 2017 really drives home just how high the stakes are in all of this.
That's the one where that white supremacist drove his car into the counter-protesters, right? Killed Heather Heyer. I remember that footage. Absolutely horrifying.
That's the one. Antifa was there at that rally, clashing with those white nationalists. The big question is, did having them there actually prevent more violence from happening, or did it just add to the chaos that led to Heyer's death?
People are still debating it.
Man, that's heavy. How do you even start to separate cause and effect in a situation like that? I mean, those far-right groups being there with their history of violence, all the hate speech, that's a recipe for disaster right there.
Oh, absolutely. And it highlights something really crucial about understanding Antifa, the historical context they're operating in. They truly see themselves as fighting against something really dangerous, something that threatens democracy, human rights, all of it. So it's not just about like being against a couple of fringe groups. They see this bigger pattern of intolerance and hate speech becoming more and more normal, and they feel like they have to resist it, even if they have to do things that are, let's say, unconventional.
Yeah. And we can't forget, they often point to what happened with fascism in Europe as like a warning. Like, look what can happen if you let these hateful ideologies just do their thing.
Yeah.
Which takes us right back to that question we were talking about. Is Antifa's approach, even with the controversial stuff, is it really necessary given the danger, or is it like an overreaction to a threat that's not as big as they think it is?
Ugh, my brain hurts. It's such a tough question, but it feels like a super important one given what's at stake. And it seems like every answer just leads to another question, like who decides what fascism even is? Because if that's what Antifa is all about, fighting it, then how you define it changes everything.
100%.
Mm-hmm.
It's not just about the words. It's about understanding what this movement is built on.
Mm-hmm.
And that's something you seem to be grappling with from those forum discussions you sent over.
Yeah, it's true. It's interesting. Some people define it really narrowly, like it's only fascism if they're literally wearing swastikas and doing the whole goose step thing.
Right.
And then others use it way more broadly. Any ideology they think is authoritarian or oppressive is fascism, no matter what side of the political spectrum it's on, which is really interesting because it speaks to this much bigger conversation about how we're even supposed to define and deal with extremism in all its forms. Like, if we make the definition too narrow, we might miss dangerous ideologies until it's too late. But if we make it too broad, then we risk shutting down dissent and legitimate opposition. It's a tough balance to find.
It is. It's about finding that sweet spot between being vigilant against threats to democracy and freedom, but also protecting free speech and making sure different viewpoints are respected.
Yeah, it's about finding that balance, and it's a conversation that requires like actual nuanced, critical thinking, being willing to engage with the fact that it's complicated. It feels like we lose sight of that a lot, especially when the media just throws those really simplified, often inflammatory stories at us.
It's true. And, speaking of the media, one of the biggest impacts of Antifa being in the U.S. is how it's affected the way we even talk about these things.
Mm-hmm.
When we were going through that Wikipedia article, I noticed it pointed out how Antifa has become this, like, lightning rod in political debates.
Yeah.
Both sides use it to try to win arguments.
Oh, totally. It's like this convenient scapegoat for some and a rallying cry for others. You
That's
see
kind of
it all the
right.
time, right? Right-wing politicians, commentators, they use Antifa as this catch-all term for any kind of protest or unrest from the left. Suddenly, every demonstration, every act of civil disobedience is being secretly run by this shadowy, all-powerful Antifa organization.
Classic tactic, right? Create a common enemy, and suddenly everyone's afraid of the same thing.
Yeah.
It's about getting people riled up, making them scared of social change, of things becoming unstable. And by making Antifa out to be this huge, organized threat to order, it makes people feel like something has to be done now. We need to crack down, bring back law and order, even if it means sacrificing some of our freedoms in the process.
It's scary how well that works. But what's even more interesting is how that whole Antifa narrative plays out on the other side. Then you've got, left-leaning people defending them as this last line of defense against fascism, right?
Yeah.
Often downplaying, even justifying the violence as a necessary response to a much bigger evil.
It becomes a moral dilemma. Do the ends justify the means, even if the means are violent? If you really believe that those far-right extremists are a threat to democracy, then maybe anything you do to stop them is automatically okay, even righteous.
It's that whole choosing the lesser of two evils thing, and it makes you realize that this whole Antifa thing isn't even just about Antifa anymore, It's like a mirror. It shows us what we really believe about justice, about freedom, about whether violence can ever be used to create a better world.
Exactly. It's like you said, it's a reflection. How we see Antifa's actions says more about our own values and prejudices than it does about the actual movement.
Which brings us back to that critical thinking thing. We can't just swallow these prepackaged narratives, especially now when there's so much information out there and it's so easy to manipulate.
You got it. We got to be willing to ask those tough questions, to find different viewpoints, and to be open to the idea that maybe we're wrong about some things. Easier said than done sometimes, right? But hey, if it were easy, everyone would be doing it. So as we're trying to wrap our heads around this whole Antifa phenomenon, what are some of the big questions we should be asking? Like, what's the end game? What are they hoping to achieve? Well, one question that keeps coming up, and it seems like you're wrestling with this too based on the stuff you shared, is whether Antifa's in-your-face tactics are actually going to work. Will they actually push back against those far-right groups, or will they accidentally cause more division and violence, like a self-fulfilling prophecy?
Million-dollar question, right? You could argue that by being willing to confront these far-right groups head-on, they've actually exposed their hateful ideologies, brought them into the open where people can see them, and that might take away their power, right?
Yeah, and there's definitely something to be said for that. Antifa has definitely been a big part of getting extremist voices deplatformed, disrupting their events, and putting pressure on businesses and institutions to cut ties with hate groups.
Oh, yeah. Like in those forum discussions you sent, there were a bunch of examples of people getting identified, outed for being part of white supremacist groups, and they ended up losing their jobs, facing social consequences.
Right, exactly. But then there's the other side of the coin. Some people argue that those tactics, even if they're coming from a good place, might actually make things worse. Like, they could be playing right into the hands of those far-right groups who can then use them as recruiting tools, as propaganda.
Yeah, I see that. It feeds into that whole fight fire with fire image. And that's powerful, especially for people who already feel like they're under attack.
Exactly. It lets them paint themselves as the real victims, the ones who are just trying to protect free speech from those violent leftists. It's a dangerous game, and it's really hard to say what the long-term effects will be.
So it's messy, it's complicated, full of contradictions, kind of like the world we live in. So where does that leave us? Any final thoughts as we finish up this deep dive on Antifa?
Well, if there's one thing to take away from all of this, it's that understanding Antifa is a process. It takes constant engagement, critical thinking. It's not about easy answers or picking a side. It's about being okay with things being complicated, with not knowing all the answers. It's about wrestling with tough ethical questions and being willing to question what you think you know.
It's about being a part of that conversation, even when it's hard, even when it's uncomfortable.
Exactly. And that's what I love about these deep dives. It's not about coming to one final conclusion. It's about giving you the tools and information so you can keep exploring on your own.
So as you keep learning about Antifa, remember to be curious, keep an open mind, and don't be afraid to be skeptical. Look for different perspectives, examine the evidence, and most importantly, be open to changing your mind as you learn more.
Because really, trying to understand Antifa is about trying to understand ourselves, our values, what we're afraid of, and how committed we are to building a world that's more just and fair. And that's a conversation we should all be having.